Almost every country on Earth is in debt. America is in debt. Japan is in debt. Britain is in debt. Germany is in debt. Even countries that seem financially powerful borrow enormous amounts of money. But that creates a strange question. If almost everyone owes money, who does everyone owe? Who is actually sitting on the other side of all this debt? Is it the banks? China? The United States? The IMF? Some secret group of billionaires? Or is there something much stranger happening? Because if the entire world owes trillions of dollars, someone, somewhere, must own those debts. And once you understand who that is, you start to see the global financial system very differently. Visual world map slowly fills with debt symbols, bonds, banks, and arrows. Let's start with something simple. Imagine the US government collects $90 in taxes, but needs to spend $100. There's a $10 gap, so the government borrows it. It can do this by issuing something called a treasury security. Think of it like an official IOU. The government receives money today. In exchange, the investor gets a promise. You will receive your money back later, plus interest. Visual, government issues a $10 bond, investor hands over $10. And here's the first important idea. One person's debt is another person's asset. To the government, that bond is debt. But to the investor holding it, that same bond is an asset. This is where the story gets interesting. Because when people hear that America owes trillions of dollars, they often imagine one enormous bill sitting on a desk somewhere. But that's not how it works. America's debt is divided among millions of financial claims. And those claims can be owned by banks, pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, individuals, foreign investors, and governments. Giant U.S. debt number breaks into thousands of bond certificates flowing toward different owners. So who actually owns government debt? The answer is a lot of different people and institutions. A pension fund might own government bonds because it needs relatively stable investments for future retirees. An insurance company might hold them because it needs assets to support future claims. A bank might own them as part of its financial assets. An investment fund might buy them because investors want exposure to government securities. And yes, foreign governments and foreign institutions can own them too. But here's the part most people misunderstand. When a foreign country owns U.S. government debt, that doesn't necessarily mean America owes that foreign government directly in some giant personal IOU. Usually, the foreign institution owns U.S. Treasury securities. And those securities can be bought and sold in financial markets. U.S. Treasury Bond Bank Investment Fund Foreign Institution. So the question changes. Instead of asking, who does America owe? We should ask, who owns America's government bonds? And that distinction matters. Because government debt isn't just money disappearing into a black hole. It becomes an asset somewhere else in the financial system. Now comes the really strange part. A country can actually owe a huge amount of money to people inside its own country. Imagine the government borrows $1,000. A domestic pension fund buys the bond. The government now owes the pension fund $1,000 plus interest. The government spends the borrowed money on roads, salaries, programs, infrastructure, or other expenses. But the pension fund still owns the government bond. So the same economy contains both sides of the transaction. The government has a liability. The pension fund has an asset. Government on left labeled debt, pension fund on right labeled asset. This is why national debt isn't exactly like your personal credit card debt. If you borrow $10,000 from a bank, the bank has a claim against you. But when a government issues bonds, those bonds can become financial assets held throughout the economy. And this creates a fascinating loop. The government borrows. Investors provide the money. The government spends it. That money enters the economy. Businesses and consumers receive it. Financial institutions collect and invest money. Some of that money eventually finds its way back into government bonds. And the cycle continues. Circular money flow, government, economy, banks, / investors, government. This is one reason the global financial system is so interconnected. Country A can issue debt. Investors in country B can buy it. A pension fund in country C can hold it. A bank in country D can finance transactions involving it. And suddenly, one government's borrowing becomes part of another country's financial system. But now you might be wondering, if governments have been borrowing for decades, why don't they just pay everything off? Why not stop borrowing, collect enough taxes, pay the debt, and finally become debt-free? It sounds logical, But governments don't operate like households. A government has ongoing expenses. It builds infrastructure, pays employees, funds public programs, responds to recessions, handles emergencies, and sometimes tax revenue simply isn't enough to cover everything. So governments borrow. But there's another important detail. Government bonds mature. That means an old bond eventually reaches the point where the government has to pay it back. But instead of paying every dollar of debt from tax revenue, governments can issue new bonds. Old debt gets paid. New debt replaces it. This is called refinancing. Old bond reaches maturity, new bond issued, debt continues. And that sounds alarming until you understand something important. Investors actually want government bonds. Why? Because they need places to put money. A pension fund doesn't want to keep every dollar sitting in cash. An insurance company doesn't either. Large investors need assets that can be bought, sold, and used as part of a broader financial strategy. Government bonds can serve that role. So the strange truth is that the world doesn't necessarily want governments to have zero debt. It wants governments to have manageable debt. And that brings us to a much bigger question. Can the entire world ever become debt-free? Technically, you could imagine governments paying down enormous amounts of debt. But remember what debt represents. Someone else's liability is often someone else's asset. If governments suddenly eliminated huge amounts of debt, financial markets would also lose huge amounts of assets that investors currently hold. Pension funds could lose investments. Banks could lose financial assets. Investment funds would have fewer securities to hold. The financial system would change dramatically. So the real goal isn't simply get debt to zero. The real question is, can the economy support the debt? And this is where debt becomes dangerous. Debt itself isn't automatically a disaster. The problem comes when the cost of servicing that debt becomes too large. Imagine you earn $5,000 a month. You owe $20,000. That might be manageable. But if your income suddenly falls while your payments increase, the same debt becomes much more difficult. Governments face a similar problem. They have revenue. They have economic growth. They have interest payments. They have existing debt. And they have new spending commitments. If interest costs rise rapidly while economic growth remains weak, debt can become much harder to manage. Debt mountain rises while GDP growth line slows. And there is another risk. Trust. Government debt works because investors believe the government will honor its obligations. If investors suddenly become worried about repayment, inflation, political instability, currency weakness, or fiscal problems, they may demand higher interest rates. Higher rates mean higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs can create even more pressure, and that can become a dangerous cycle. But here's the biggest revelation. After all this, you might still be waiting for the mysterious answer. Who is the person collecting all the world's debt? Who owns the mountain? The answer is, there is no single owner. There isn't one secret bank sitting in a giant vault collecting every country's payments. There isn't one country that owns the entire world. There isn't one billionaire holding the global IOU. The system is much more complicated and much more ordinary. Governments owe money to banks. Banks hold government securities. Pension funds hold government securities. Insurance companies hold government securities. Investment funds hold government securities. Individuals can hold government securities. Foreign institutions can hold them. Central banks can hold them. And all of these pieces interact. Giant web connecting governments, banks, pension funds, investors, and central banks. That means the world's debt is not just a mountain of money that somebody owes to somebody else. It is a giant network of financial relationships. One government's liability can become another institution's asset. One country's borrowing can become another country's investment. One person's safe investment can be another government's obligation. And suddenly, the original question looks completely different. If every country is in debt, who do they owe? The answer is, they owe each other, their own citizens, their financial institutions, foreign investors, governments, and countless other holders of debt securities. The world isn't simply drowning in debt. The world is connected by debt. And that's why the real danger isn't necessarily that the world has debt. It's what happens when people stop believing that the debt can be managed. Because the global financial system runs on something more powerful than money. It runs on trust. And if trillions of dollars of debt are built on the assumption that tomorrow's promises will still be honored, then there's one final question worth asking. What happens when that trust disappears? If you want more videos that explain the financial system without the complicated jargon, subscribe, because the next part of this story gets even stranger.